And the red light means we are good to go. So, Jerry, how about you take us away with week 4?
All right. Well, it's good to see everybody again this evening. Um, after last week's lesson at the very end, Charlene asked if we could spend some time at the beginning, this time talking a little bit about different groups within modern day Judaism. So I thought I would take a minute to do that. It's not exactly introduction to the Old Testament, but it is what those communities have become in this world. So I'll take just a minute to talk about the sort of major, we might say even denominations within Judaism presently. The most conservative group, of course, is Orthodox Judaism. They are literalists when it comes to keeping the Torah and when it comes to keeping the traditional interpretations from the Mishnah and the Talmud. The Mishnah is a volume that was produced in the 2nd century that records what earlier rabbis had said about how to keep the law. And then the Talmud is produced after that for another new time to interpret what the Mishnah means they should do for this time. So there's sort of this rolling, record of how you're supposed to live and how our leaders have interpreted it. And so Orthodox Jews take those kinds of commands literally. And you can see it in many of the distinctive things about them, including their dress, but maybe the most distinctive thing would be sort of their long sideburn growth called a payot that is sort of in response to one of the commands that says, don't shave your sideburns the way that those pagans do. So it's one of those commands that, again, kept Israel separate. If you want to think about them in terms of what the equivalent would be within Christianity, they'd be the Christian fundamentalists. So they're kind of way over there to the right. Moving a bit to the left is what's known as conservative Judaism. They are less tied to all of the specifics of the Talmud, but they're still very serious about Jewish distinctiveness and about observing Jewish rituals from the Torah and the Talmud. So you'll see them, for example, one of the ways that they keep different kinds of food apart is to have different sinks. So if meat and dairy is not supposed to touch, they'll have a sink dedicated to meat and another one to dairy or to other things. So they're quite, say, sticklers for some things, but not to the extreme that you see in the Orthodox Jews. But still, they sort of their official position is that their rabbis won't do faith or interfaith marriages and things like that. So they're very serious about living an observant Jewish lifestyle. If you want to think about them as a parallel to Christian churches, they're probably the more enlightened evangelicals. So they're not people that go around denying scientific claims and things like that. But they are looking for ways to follow as closely as they can the specific instructions that they find in the text and in tradition. Reform Judaism is then a form of Judaism that is less tied to explicitly and literally keeping lots of those traditional Jewish observances. And they give more attention to social justice issues. So while the first two groups may focus on the Torah, they focus on the prophets. And so some Reform Jews don't do things like keep the Jewish food laws, or at least they're less strict about them. So maybe they don't eat pork, or at least not very often, but neither do they keep separate sinks and things like that. So they sort of move away from identifying sort of their faith with those traditional practices. They don't worry about whether they go to work on the Sabbath and things like that, though they're interested in Sabbath keeping. So they're more liberal on social issues than other groups with that we've talked about within Judaism. And so if you wanted to think of a Christian parallel with them, they're kind of like the liberal Protestants. Okay. And then there's a group known as Reconstructionist Judaism, and they are the most liberal of all. They say that Judaism is certainly unique, but not superior to other religious groups. They say that Judaism can change their laws based on social environment, and Reform Jews would think something along those lines as well. But Reconstructionist Judaism is clearly less tied to tradition than even Reform Judaism. They look for universal values, and they see Judaism as one expression of those values, an important one that ought to be preserved, but not the only one that gives expression to them. And if you were to think about where they would fit, they're kind of like the Unitarians of Judaism. Okay, so you can, believe lots of different things and be there. But I think Charlene's question came up because of contacts with Messianic Jews. And we should note that other Jews don't think that people who call themselves Messianic Jews are Jews. Okay? They are not within Judaism. They sort of see, Messianic Jews see themselves as Jews who believe in Jesus, as observant Jews who believe in Jesus. And they have a fairly moderate form of conservative Christianity. They read scripture and follow its commands much the way evangelicals do, except they also follow the laws of the Old Testament that other Christians do not. And so they live like observant Jews, seemingly close to conservative Judaism's kind of observance. However, 50% of them are not Jews. That is, they are Gentiles who have adopted that manner of life. And so that's another one of the reasons that other groups within Judaism don't see them as a group within Judaism, but a group of Christians trying to sneak in and proselytize, basically. So this group, they're big supporters of Israel and often see it in the kind of end time scheme with, Jesus coming back and Israel playing a central role in that end time stuff. So, all right, those are, I think, the major groups within Judaism. Anybody have any questions or comments about those? Yeah, Jan?
Jerry, the rabbi who's most often in the news and associated with the University Judaism Center, would he be conservative?
I'm not sure which one you have in mind, but if he is the rabbi of the temple, then he's Reform Judaism. And if he's the rabbi of the synagogue, then he's conservative.
Okay.
So they call their houses of worship different things.
Jerry, it's Vicky. What branches are Hasidic Jews? Because I know the existence of them and I do not know anything about them.
Yeah, they are a branch within Orthodox.
Okay.
So they are among those very conservative sorts of observances. Other things? Well, all right.
Jerry, this
yes,
Kurt. Yeah, the guy Jan was asking about, I think, is he directs the student center near campus. Um, and I don't know if that makes him a synagogue or a temple.
Yeah, I don't know who sponsors that center,
Yeah.
so I'm not sure, but probably it says somewhere which one of the, if you were to look it up, it'll tell you which one they belong to. Well, all right, let's turn our attention back to sort of ancient times. You remember last week, we finished up our discussion of the Pentateuch. We've been talking about the narratives and the ways that those narratives sort of help explain how the world got to be the way it is and give ways to think about how to live in it, how to think about our own identity as the people of God. And of course, the Pentateuch also contains those laws that set out how Israel is supposed to live. And we talked about how they come into being, at least in the form that we have them, significantly later than most of us think of them being written, so that they don't come into the form that we know them, at least until the time of the exile. And that's the case for basically all of the books that are in the Hebrew Bible. That's really when their form takes shape. Some of them contain clearly materials, as we've said, much older, but all of them get shaped and edited at the time of the exile, and some of them much later than that. So we want to turn our attention tonight to a section of the Hebrew Bible that the Jewish Bible calls the former prophets. And we know those books as the books that go from Joshua to 2nd Kings minus Ruth. So it's Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings. And you can think about 1st and 2nd Chronicles as sort of fitting into this group, though they have a little bit of a distinctive perspective. Those books recount the conquest of the land of Canaan, all the way through to the monarchy in Israel and Judah, and finally the exile of all of the Israelites. So they tell the story of the life of the people of Israel, basically from the death of Moses through the end of having any nations of Israelites in Palestine. And these narratives, while they have different theological points to make in different ways, and you can see that again, differences have been brought together, they still have one overarching point of view, and that is the pattern of the life of Israel that's set out in the book of Deuteronomy. Remember, we talked about that last week and how the book of Deuteronomy says, look, if you do what God says, things will go well with you and as a nation. And if you do not, then things are going to really go bad. So here's the way it's set out in Deuteronomy 11. Moses here speaking, I am setting before you today a blessing and a curse. The blessing, if you obey the commandments of the Lord your God that I am commanding you today, and the curse, if you do not obey the commandments of the Lord your God, but turn from the way that I am commanding you today to follow other gods that you have not known. So Deuteronomy repeatedly says that's the way the life of the Israelites is going to be. And all of these books from Joshua to 2nd Kings say, see, that's exactly the way it works. Okay, so they're sort of the story demonstration of that way of sort of understanding the story of the people of Israel. And so the book of Joshua starts with the death of Moses and tells about the conquest of the land. And the story it tells makes it clear that the people who are Israelites take over Palestine only because God decided they should have it. It has nothing to do with who has the bigger or more powerful army. The Israelites get the land because God gives it to them. And you can see that clearly with the first story. And we all know the story of the walls of Jericho, right? I mean, the way, that's quite a military tactic, right? March around and play music at them. We did try that in Nicaragua, though, I think. We tried to blast that one guy out. But they just march around the city, blow some trumpets, and go home. And then the seventh day they do that, they march around 7 times, blow the trumpets and holler, and the walls fall down and they take the city. Okay, so not exactly the kind of great military battle one might think of. It has to be engaged in to take a city. So it's clear God is going to give them this land, but giving that land demands that they live as God tells them to. And so God says to the people, listen, I'm giving you this first town, but none of you can have anything from it. You have to give all of the good stuff to me. So all the valuable things, silver, gold, jewels, clothes, whatever it is, anything they would have normally gone, we're the victors, this is how we get our salary. They get none of that. Nobody gets to have anything. And so one guy decides he just really likes some stuff, some silver and some gold. And so he takes it for himself and he hides it in his tent. And so the Israelites get to go to the next city. And they go to the next city and say, we're going to go attack this city. And they get defeated. They get routed and people get killed. And so Joshua goes before God and says, what's the deal? What did we do? And God says, somebody took some of that stuff I told them not to take. And if you don't do what I tell you, I'm not going to give you the land. And so they hunt him down and kill him and all of his family and burn all their stuff. And then they're once again successful. Now, that's a horrible story. We don't see people's families as responsible for what they did. But as in this era, sort of, they think about families as corporate units, so that what one does, the whole family does. So they sort of inflict the punishment in that way. And so the book of Joshua goes on then telling about how successful the Israelites are in taking all of the land. And once you get to the end of this book, then God's promises to the Israelites have been fulfilled. God has brought them out of Egypt through the desert and given them the land. And so things should be really good. And so that's the end of the time that we need Joshua around as the leader. He's the leader for the campaign to take the land. And so we have sort of a farewell speech. Remember, the book of Deuteronomy is a farewell speech through and through. I mean, it just starts with Moses saying, here's a farewell speech, and then he makes 4 of them. So we just get one from Joshua, but it has a famous passage. But it's important because it again reiterates how you are to think about the fate of the people of Israel as a whole. So let me read. We're in chapter 24 of Joshua. I'm going to read verses 14 through 18. That's a part of the farewell speech. It says, now therefore, revere the Lord and serve him in sincerity and in faithfulness. Put away the gods that your ancestors served beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. Now, if you are unwilling to serve the Lord, choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your ancestors served in the region beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord." Then the people promised, "Far be it from us that we should forsake the Lord to serve other gods. For it is the Lord our God who brought us and our ancestors up from the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, who did those great signs in our sight. He protected us along all the way that we went and among all the peoples through whom we passed. And the Lord drove out before us all the peoples, the Amorites who lived in the land. Therefore, we also will serve the Lord our God." So here they renew the covenant. We promise to worship God, not other gods. The next paragraph has Joshua say, "Now, if you don't do this, then you're going to have big trouble. If you make this agreement and then you worship other gods, then God's going to let you be taken over. And if you serve God, then things are going to go well for the nation." So they make the promise. So they have committed themselves to worship just God. Now, if we were to read those stories in Joshua, we would be distressed at the description of the way that they take over these cities. When they take them over, they don't just defeat them militarily, they kill everybody and everything. That is, they kill all the people in the towns and sometimes all the livestock. It's sort of all the way down to the house pets. It all has to go. And that seems, like the worst kind of behavior. And certainly, if we were to imitate it, it certainly would be. So we have to ask, why in the world would these texts portray the people of God behaving in such vicious and murderous ways? Well, I think the first thing I want to do is to assure you that that is part of the literary creation of the book of Joshua. And everybody who originally read these texts and heard these stories knew they didn't really do all that. Because the book of Judges starts out by saying, if we had done that, things would be good. But we didn't. So in Judges chapter 2, it starts by saying, "Now the angel of the Lord went up from Gilgal to Bochim and said, I brought you up from Egypt and brought you into the land that I promised to your ancestors. I said, I will never break my covenant with you. For your part, do not make a covenant with the inhabitants of this land. Tear down their altars. But you have not obeyed my command. See what you have done? Now I say, I will not drive them out before you, but they shall become adversaries to you, and their gods shall be a snare to you." And when the angel of the Lord spoke these words to all the Israelites, the people lifted up their voices and wept. All right. So basically this text says, you know how we said we killed all those people? Well, we didn't. Okay. If we had have, it would have been a good thing, but we didn't. So I don't know if that makes it worse or better, to say it really would have been a great idea to kill all those people, or to have gone ahead and done it. So why do these books think that would have been a good idea? Well, I think it's for the same reason that they have so many laws that make them so different from their neighbors. Remember, nobody in that world worshiped one God. Nobody. And everybody, including the Israelites, thought it was a really stupid idea to worship just one God, because all gods have their own jobs. The God of herders has one job, and the God of farmers has another one. And so why would you pick just one of those as a nation? Don't you want to have good sheep herds as well as good crops? And so nobody thinks it makes any sense. And yet the text says that's what the Israelites had agreed to do. So the laws, remember those purity laws and other laws about what they can and can't eat or how they can dress or all those kind of things, they're all to keep Israel separate from their neighbors. Because if they're not separate from their neighbors, they will never worship just God. They will always worship the gods that their neighbors do. These stories about killing other people is one more manifestation of that idea, that the only way for us to be faithful to God is not to be around people who worship multiple gods, because we just can't help ourselves. We're going to worship those other gods if we are around them. And if you don't believe it, look at the whole history of the nation. That is what we have always done. And so these texts want to say we have to do what it takes to be faithful to God. Remember, these stories get put into the shape we have them at the time of the exile. They know what happens if you don't keep this covenant with God. The nations fall. And so these horrible stories about being willing to kill people are illustrations of just how important faithfulness is. Being faithful to God and God's covenant is more important than life, yours or somebody else's. Now, we might not want to say it in that way, but seeing faithfulness with that seriousness, it has a lot going for it. Okay? And remember, it seems reasonable to us to worship one God. It seemed unreasonable to them. So they're trying to get the point across that nothing is more important than being willing to be faithful to God. Nothing is more important than living up to our commitments to God. All right, let me stop there and see if there are thoughts or questions. Okay, we're not done with war. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. How would the different groups he outlined, this is Kurt, outlined earlier, see those stories? Would they see them the same way, or would they have the same range of interpretation or understanding that we might have?
Yeah, they're likely to have a full range of interpretations. There are certainly Jewish interpreters who belong to all of those branches of Judaism. So just like there's a huge range of readings depending on whether you're a fundamentalist or somebody who's in one of the mainline denominations. So the same kinds of differences are going to be seen in those groups.
So I'm guessing the Reform would read it as you're reading it. What about the more progressive conservative bunch, if that's an oxymoron or whatever?
Yeah,
you know.
sort of the middle group.
Yeah.
I think the middle group has lots of folks who, I would say the majority of folks like rabbis who are in conservative Judaism would not read these stories as straightforwardly historical. They would see them trying to get a theological point across.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Okay. Well, all right. So we've seen the Israelites take over the land of Palestine. And now we have seen that they didn't do everything that God told them to do. So the book of Judges covers the time from when Joshua dies through The story that we looked at the other night that has the various tribes in Israel come together and really kill a bunch of the tribe of Benjamin because of the rape of the concubine. And so it goes through this fairly long period of time when Israel has to fight against earlier inhabitants of Canaan, the peoples who were known as Midianites and Amalekites and Moabites and Philistines and Ammonites. Or we might see them as kind of the indigenous peoples of Palestine, or at least the people who were in control at the time when the Israelites arrived. During this time, the Israelites don't have a central government. Basically, the tribes govern themselves, but they have connections, recognize ancestral ties, and those kinds of things. But in times of crisis, leaders emerged and brought the various tribes together to fight against their enemies. And we call those sort of military leaders judges. So the judges emerge as the people who rescue the Israelite tribes from their oppression by other people who are vying for control of Palestine. And the book of Judges really, in some ways, tells the same story 12 times. You get 12 of those judges, and each one of them arises for the same reason and accomplishes the same thing. Okay? The problems, again, begin because the Israelites didn't get rid of those neighbors, but chose to live among them. And so God says, Israel, you're not going to be able to keep the covenant. Those folks will, in fact, be your adversaries. And so they are. So it sets out very clearly what the book is going to be about. So it tells you, here's what it is. So I'm going to read, it's a fairly long read, but it's in chapter 2, verses 11 through 19. And this is the key phrase that you will hear constantly in the rest of this material. And remember, this material is called the Deuteronomistic history. That is the story of the people of Israel according to the pattern of Deuteronomy. Okay, so it says, then the Israelites did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. That's probably the most repeated phrase in this whole literature. I mean, it says this all the time about them. Okay? So then the Israelites did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and worshiped the Baals, and they abandoned the Lord, the God of their ancestors, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. They followed other gods from among the gods of the peoples who were all around them and bowed down to them, and they provoked the Lord to anger. They abandoned the Lord and worshiped Baal and Astartes. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he gave them over to plunderers who plundered them, and he sold them into the power of their enemies all around, so that they could no longer withstand their enemies. Whenever they marched out, the hand of the Lord was against them to bring misfortune, as the Lord had warned them and sworn to them, and they were in great distress. Then the Lord raised up judges who delivered them out of the power of those who plundered them. Yet they did not listen even to their judges, for they lusted after other gods and bowed down to them. They soon turned aside from the way in which their ancestors had walked, who had obeyed the commandments of the Lord. They did not follow their example. Whenever the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge, and he delivered them from the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. For the Lord would be moved to pity by their groaning because of those who persecuted and oppressed them. But whenever the judge died, they would relapse and behave worse than their ancestors, following other gods, worshiping them, and bowing down to them. All right, so that's the pattern of the book. The people worship other gods. They get taken over by other armies. And when they turn to God, God feels sorry for them, raises up this judge. The judge wins their freedom, and they kind of worship God for a while. Hey, and then the judge dies and they go back just like they were worshiping the other gods. So that is what the whole book of Judges does 12 times. Okay, so it wants to make sure you see this is not an occasional relapse, people. This is the way it is all the time. You know, when we're in Sunday school, sometimes we go, you know, those Israelites worshiped God, and then occasionally they would turn aside and worship other gods. No, it was just the opposite. It's that most of the time they worshiped multiple gods, and every once in a while they would worship just God. Okay, so that's the way these stories present the whole thing. And so whether the Israelites win or nothing in this book has nothing to do with whether they have a good army. It only has to do with, are they worshiping God or other gods? That's what determines whether you win a war. Now, remember, they'll tell you occasionally, there's some other books if you want to read about that military history or political history. This is the theological interpretation. This is where we talk about what God had to do with it all. And so we keep having this way of thinking about Israel's history. Once we get past the judges and we get kings, then it's the same way. Nearly every king, the story of a huge percentage of the kings of both Israel and Judah ends with, and he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. You know, I mean, that's just the way the governing structure was. Now, as we think about that telling of the story of the people and the nations of Israel and Judah, we have to remember that these books are written in the time of the exile. And so the nation is gone, the temple is gone, they don't live in the land that God promised them, and they need an explanation. Why is that the case? The God of our ancestors said, we will have that land, we will have a kingdom there, and we don't. So does that say something bad about God? Does that mean God's not powerful enough to keep the land in our control? Does it mean that God just doesn't care about us? Does it mean that God doesn't keep God's promises? What does it mean? And the answer they arrived at was, there's nothing wrong with God. The problem is us. We promised God that we would be faithful to God, and we never were. And so this is what we should expect. Remember, we keep being reminded, here are the conditions of the covenant. If you do what you're supposed to, just worship God, things will go well for the nation. And if you don't, you worship all these other gods, then things are going to go bad. And they did. And now they've gone really bad. We have lost everything. There are no Jewish kingdoms in Palestine at all. So they look back and see, first of all, their own unfaithfulness. We kept deserting God. But that's not all they see. They see, secondly, look, God rescued us every time. And you know what? It looks really bad now. But if we could trust God to rescue us every time we did this before, then you know what? God's going to rescue us again. This was a way to express confidence in the faithfulness of God, the way to express confidence in the love of God. the certainty that God would not desert the covenant. When the people got taken over by other people, it didn't mean the covenant came to an end. That was part of the covenant. So God stays in the covenant all the time. And so God is still in the covenant with us now. That means God is going to bring us back to the land. God is going to save us yet again. So these texts don't just blame Israel for not being faithful. They also express confidence in God's saving power and say, God's going to do it again. Now, there was a question in the chat a minute ago about when did the Israelites start worshiping one God? Well, certainly not before the exile. They begin to do it then, and some of them, a few of them had done it earlier, but a larger percentage begin to do it in the exile. But they still struggle with worshiping other gods when they return to Palestine in the 5th century. So prophets still have to say, don't worship the gods of your neighbors. Okay. And from there, between then and say, probably the 2nd century, certainly someplace in the 3rd century, it becomes the dominant thing to worship only God. But that didn't always mean they didn't call on other beings for some things. There's good evidence that even in the 1st century, Jews called upon angelic beings of various sorts to do things like heal sicknesses and things like that. But they distinguished between that veneration and asking for requests and worshiping God. So certainly by the 2nd century and seemingly in the 3rd, Jews begin to define themselves as the people who worship only God. So it takes a long time in their story. Sometimes when we read these stories about the Israelites being defeated and, all those kind of things, we think that God sounds really mean. I mean, here these people mess up, and so God lets them be slaughtered. That seems awful. But actually, they're intended to do the opposite. They're intended to say, this God is faithful and loving, and you can see it because this God takes us back every time. All we have to do is say, God, we're really sorry. And God goes, all right, come on back. And so they get to come back. And so while if we read the stories individually, they look like God is mean. If you keep reading the stretch, it's like, look how many times God took them back. You could think, when Peter asks, how many times do I have to forgive? 7? And Jesus says, no, 70 times 7. And Jesus could have said, just look at the Deuteronomistic history. That's what God has been doing to you people forever, that you keep turning away and God goes, come on back, I forgive you. So there's this whole pattern of the people being unfaithful, God constantly being faithful. So these stories that stretch from the time they get to the land of Canaan through the time that there's no kingdom are expressions of faith in God that say, God's going to bring us back. We're going to be forgiven again, just like we have been all those zillions of times. And God's going to be with us in the land and things are going to be good. And sometimes there are these amazing expressions of how sure they're going to be. At the end of the book of Joshua, there's this long section that sets out all the boundaries of where every one of the tribes is supposed to live. Now, that may not sound very spectacular if it's in a book that's written while the people are in the land. But if it's written while they're sitting in Babylon, with no land and no government and no temple. And they go, here's how sure we're coming back. We're going to mark exactly where all of us are supposed to live because we're going to be there. God's going to do it for us again. All right. These stories want to make Israel be faithful as they're confident in the faithfulness of God. And hopefully, as we read these stories as a unit, they can help us to see the way that God is committed to God's people, and so encourage our faithfulness when we know how much love and faithfulness God has toward us as the people of God as well. All right, let me stop there and see if there are thoughts about this section of the Hebrew Bible.
Jerry, that's really helpful for me, just to remember that there's a larger context here. I think so often I pick up a chapter and I'm like, I don't get what it's saying. I give up. So to know that, just to be encouraged that there's a larger story there is really helpful for me.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, I think most of us sort of we're brought up picking up those stories individually and going, let's talk about this one, and not seeing, wait, it's really just one piece of a puzzle. That if you don't keep the puzzle in mind, you're not going to see the big thing that this story's about. Yeah. No. Yeah, Jan.
The reference to God always keeping covenant. I think of when I catch Franklin Graham, who says, if you'll just pray, if you'll just confess your sins, God will take you back. I mean, it's like the Protestant story, and Franklin's not one of my favorite people, but it's just interesting to see that. And I don't deny the significance of it, but he could be a rabbi for all I care.
Right. But think about how many people say they don't feel worthy to be forgiven.
Yeah.
And these stories say, yeah,
Yes, you are.
You can't be worse than these people were. I mean, so you're in,
Jerry,
Mhm.
these judges for us is a word that seems to have a different meaning than is used here. How did that label come to be placed on these folks?
Yeah. Well, I think it began with the meaning of something like they're the ones who bring God's judgment against the other people, or they're the ones who even say something about God's judgment that's come on God's own people. So very few of them have anything to do with the court system, but at least one does, actually. Deborah, who was one of these leaders, is known as a person who sits at the gate, that is, among the city's elders and leading citizens, and she adjudicates cases. So she is somebody who had sort of both roles. But these judges are people who are somehow seen to be endowed by God with some kind of charismatic power that helps them funnel the power of God into sort of this military campaign. So if we want to think about judge, we'll have to think about them bringing God's judgment on those who oppressed God's people. That's the best I can do.
They sound more like warlords sometimes.
They were, and you should see them as warlords. Yes, that's exactly how they functioned. So you can see them, again, sort of chosen from among the leading citizens. I mean, one of the judges, all the people ask him to be it because he's got the reputation for being the most successful general. Um, so these are military leaders. So they are gathering an army and going out and attacking and then saying, I'm now the de facto ruler for a while. Yeah, David?
Jerry, I just want to clarify one thing, and then I want to ask you a question. Because I think it's educational. I didn't get a chance to clarify Kurt's question about the Jewish Student Union, if you will, UK. That is Orthodox. That's Rabbi Shlomo Litvin, and he is an Hasidic Jew. So that is Orthodox Judaism right there. Then, as someone else mentioned, or Jerry did, out on Alumni, before you get to New Circle Road, on the left is the synagogue. That is conservative, but know that they have a female rabbi. Okay, so Jerry equated them with enlightened evangelicals, and it is a conservative synagogue, but they have a female rabbi. Mm-hmm. And then the Reformed Temple, which is on Ashland, north of Richmond Road, of Main Street, is David Wirtschafter, who came and did a Seder for Central a few years ago. So we have all three major branches of Judaism represented in Lexington. Just wanted to clarify that for everyone. And Vicki even mentioned Hasidic Judaism, and Rabbi Litvin is Hasidic. Jerry, I wanted to ask you, did you say that Ruth is part of the Deuteronomistic history or not?
It is not, no.
Not. And so I just want to say, Jerry, thank you so much for setting this in the context of the aversion, if you will, and the stay away from the Gentiles, because to have Ruth right there then serves as this incredible counter narrative, if you will, to all of that. So I just had to clarify that.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's not the place where Ruth is in the Hebrew Bible. That's the Protestant way of arranging the books.
Oh, I didn't know that. Thank you.
So, yeah, Ruth, of course, is the story of King David's grandmother. So that he is 1/4 Gentile, even as he is the ideal Jew. So they have the need to be separate, but Ruth is acceptable because she says, your God will be my God. So she commits herself to the worship of the one God, and that makes her somebody who you can have around. Other things? All right. Well, let's turn ourselves to the prophetic books. So we've gotten kind of this story of the people and how they have moved through sort of being chosen, being, taken into slavery, saved, given a land, been unfaithful, and now exiled. The prophets sort of plug into that picture from about the time when there start to be kings, at least the written prophets. The books of the prophets, though, are written in very different ways, rather than just being the story that gets told and some interpretation. They have some narrative, but then they also have instructions that say, thus says the Lord. So in some ways, they have a combination of what you have in the law, where the law says, thus says the Lord, and the narratives say, here's the way to understand what's happening in our country and in our history. So they tell the story and fit that thus says the Lord into particular context. And the prophets, give interpretations of current events. They offer guidance, religious guidance, as well as political guidance. Now, the written prophets begin in the 8th century, but prophets like Elijah and Elisha in the 10th century are really the beginning of these prophets that we'll see writings from. They sort of set the standard for what prophets are going to be. When we think about prophets, oftentimes we think about prophets as kind of loners who are out there, and suddenly God speaks to them and says, I want you to be a prophet. And then they go, okay, and they go speak the word of the Lord or something. But that happened occasionally, but not very often. And it's so uncommon that a prophet like Amos has to say, listen, I didn't plan on being a prophet. I was happy being a farmer, and the Lord came to me. So it's like, I'm different from these other guys. And you can see that there is even a school to learn how to become a prophet. If you look in 2 Kings chapter 2, when they're telling the story of Elijah about being ready to be taken up into heaven, Elisha shows up, and in chapter 2, verse 3, it says, the company of the prophets who were in Bethel came out to meet Elisha. Now, this company of the prophets is basically a school. It's where you go to learn how to be a prophet. It is basically prophet seminary. So if you want to be a prophet, you go off to school, and you can have as your headmaster Elijah. Hard to beat that. Yeah, and there's going to be Elisha after that. But there are these schools of the prophets in various places throughout the land. Okay? And so when the prophets finish seminary, most of them are not just independent preachers out there somewhere. Lots of them go to work for the government. There's a whole group of prophets that work for the king. There's a whole group of prophets that work for the temple. They're on salary, either from the king or from the temple. Not all of them, but a lot of them. Some of them have jobs, maybe in, helping their villages do various things. But you should think of sort of the biggest concentration of prophets being the king's court. That's where prophets work. They are people very much in the public sphere. And all those times when we hear about prophets complaining about false prophets, they just say what the king wants to hear. Well, yeah, because he does pay your salary. So it makes some sense, not to make him too mad. So you have all of this group of prophets, who are together. Many of them are wealthy, upper class sorts of people. Many of them would have been among the literate, which makes them among the few and the privileged. And so don't think about prophets as these lone voices out in the desert somewhere. These are folks who are addressing the political leaders. If they're not doing it in Jerusalem, they're doing it in the provincial capitals. They talk most of the time to the people who are in political control of the situation. They don't nearly as often talk to regular people. I mean, we think about prophets as folks who, preach on Sunday at a local church, but mostly they're people who are talking to political leaders. We see it all throughout the prophets. Now, when we go to read a prophet, one of these books of the prophets, we have to read the prophet really in two contexts. One of them is that they'll tell the story about the prophet. Now, remember, most of these books are not written by the prophet himself. Rather, They're written sometime after the prophet is dead. And you could tell it because they're not written in the first person. Seldom do they say, I was doing this. Now, there'll be sections that do. So, for example, if you look at Isaiah having this wonderful experience of the presence of God, that's his call to be a prophet. He says, I saw the Lord. So there you get a firsthand account, but you get 2 or 3 chapters down the road and it's all he did this and he did that. So it's not actually being written by Isaiah. Isaiah may have written down his oracles, or someone else might have written them down, but somebody else puts these books together that tell about sort of what the prophet was doing and in what context the prophet was doing it. So we have to think about, okay, here is the setting that the writer wants us to see the prophet in. So the prophet, is here speaking to people who live in the 8th century. So there's the message for the people of the 8th century. But the person who puts this material together wants this book to speak to his own time. So somehow it doesn't just address the issues of the 8th century. It addresses the later time when the writers bring together those oracles and put them with those stories about what the prophets did. And sometimes those traditions about what the prophets did and said were growing things. So the book of Isaiah has a minimum of 3 different prophets named Isaiah who get talked about in this book. They represent different time frames. You can tell from who they talk about as the enemies of God and things like that. And so we see these books beginning with these oracles, but then becoming these stories about the prophets with the oracles mixed in, and sometimes that just keep going, keep growing. Overall, the prophetic books have 2 central messages. One is they call Israel to get rid of social, economic, and cultural injustice. That is, they're the ones who say that the political systems, the economic systems, and the social systems violate the will of God. They are not just. They do not privilege the poor. And so they are not acceptable to God. But their second message is equally present and powerful. And it is that Israel must worship only God. And if they don't do both of these things, then punishment will come upon them. And by the time we get to these prophets, we have nations, Israel and Judah. And the message is, if you don't reform the economic and political and social systems, the nation will fall. And if you don't turn to worship only God, the nation will fall. Now, those are hard messages. Remember, we've talked about how difficult it is for anybody to worship just one God. But I told you all of those prophets are employed at the king's court and at the temple. It's not just prophets of the God of Israel who work for the king. There are plenty of other God's prophets who also work for the king. So even built into sort of the political / religious structure of the kingdoms is worship and depending on more than one God. When we think about prophets, we usually think about prophets predicting the future. Well, these prophets didn't intend to predict the distant future for the most part. For most of them, they predicted what maybe any good political analyst could have predicted. So instead of saying, here's what's going to happen in 200 years, they said, the Lord said, you should make a treaty with the Egyptians, not the Assyrians. That's the will of the Lord. And then if the king doesn't do it and it goes bad, they say, see, you should have listened to what the Lord had to say. So prophets are working on giving instructions for the people in their moment. They're not concerned mostly about what's happening in the distant future. They want to say, here's what people need to do now to do what's pleasing to God. Here's what we need to do to the social system, the economic system, who we have as our allies, who we're going to worship. Those are the things they want to pay attention to. The writers of the books see those oracles and those stories as things that can direct the lives of the people of God way past the time when just the prophet was trying to convince the rulers to change things to be more like what God would have them be. The prophets weren't all that successful. At least the pre-exilic prophets were not that successful in the sense that they got a lot of followers. Very few kings decided, oh yeah, I think we should worship only God. Oh yeah, I think we should stop rewarding my cronies and take care of the poor. You know, those kind of things didn't happen most of the time when the prophets spoke. Oh, but that didn't keep them from doing their best to say, this is the way God wants us to live. And by not living in these ways, we violate the covenant. Remember, we noted in the law that there were all kinds of protections for people who were poor, all kinds of rules about the economic system, all kinds of things. And these prophets say, and we are not doing them, and we will pay for that. The law says we worship only God, and we are not doing that, and we will pay for that. All right. So that's how the pre-exilic prophets talk. Okay. But there are also prophets who appear once the kingdoms are gone. Once the people are in Babylon, the prophetic voice doesn't stop. And there, the prophets again call for faithfulness. But this time, they offer hope. Instead of offering so much condemnation, they're the ones who are saying, you can trust God to bring us back. All we have to do is what we always did, turn to God, and God will save us. So they were the ones who were encouraging the people of Judah to turn to God, remembering all of the times that God has saved us before. And then, even when the people do return to the land, there's another round of prophets. And these prophets both reinterpret older prophecies and call for the people of Judah to be faithful in this new environment where they find themselves. And we want to say more about each one of these and give some examples of the various times. But let me stop there for just a second and see if there are any thoughts or questions before we look at some pre-exilic prophets. All right. Let's think about what are known as the classical prophets. They're called classical because they wrote. Okay, these are the ones, before this, Elijah and Elisha were great prophets, but the best we can tell, they didn't write down their oracles. But these folks in the 8th century begin to write down their oracles. And so good examples of these prophets are Amos and Micah. Their books are a mix of narratives and oracles, those thus says the Lord, and most of their oracles are poetry. So they're talented poets, as well as that's the way the Lord speaks, is in poetry. And so they would sort of set up a context and say, here is God's response to that. And they say, thus says the Lord, and then do their prophecy. And as you go through these stories, as they tell what's happening and tell God's evaluation, it's always bad. God's always going, you people are doing horrible. You're doing all of these terrible things. And so the message of exilic prophets, for the most part, is repent or die. And if you don't quit this, then the end of the nation is on the way. Things are bad the way we're doing them. But it's not all of the prophets work precisely in the same way. The prophet Hosea is a strange one in the mix. Its narrative, rather than just telling you about here's what's happening in the nation and here's how God is responding to it, the narrative of Hosea is more individual and personal, and it's actually a metaphor instead of just being the story of what happens. Hosea is commanded by God to marry a sex worker and to have children. And so, as the dutiful prophet, he does just that. And God even tells him how to name his children. So he has his first child and he says, okay, I want you to name this child Jezreel, because at Jezreel, there was this huge slaughter of people so that a king could come to power. Well, not a great thing to name your kid after, right? No, but that's what Hosea does. So Hosea and his wife, whose name was Gomer, have a second child, and she gets named Lo Ruhamah, which means not pitied. I don't have any pity on you. So again, not a great name you're going to have for your kid. It's like, I really don't care about you. And then he has a third child, and this one is named Lo Ami, and it means not my people. Basically, that's not my kid. So it is not a good set of names for Hosea to give to his children. And we hear that his wife is being unfaithful to him. And that's a metaphor for Israel's unfaithfulness to God. And so he is to marry this faithless person so that this new analogy for the relationship of God and God's people can show sort of the seriousness of Israel's turning to other gods and how painful it is. Hosea then contains some more usual oracles, but he doesn't end on that dreadful note. Instead, Hosea is one of those prophets that says, if we keep doing like we are, we're going to be destroyed. But that will not be the last word. God will bring us back. And so he says, here's what God says about the names of these kids. Okay, Jezreel, the site of that terrible massacre, it's also, the word means God sows. That is, God sows a field. So God plants all of this goodness for us to have. And that daughter that was named Lo Rahamah, the word lo in Hebrew is no. So instead of being Lo Ruhamah, she's just going to be Ruhamah. You are pitied. We do love you and feel sorry for you. And the poor kid, not my kid, the Lo Ami, his name is going to be my kid. You are my people. And so Hosea points to a time that despite the unfaithfulness of Israel, God takes them back. God still loves both Israel and the children. Now, there are lots of things that might be said about that story. But one of the things that I want us to notice is that it makes the person who is unfaithful in this story the wife. That becomes a tradition among the prophets, that when they want to portray the unfaithfulness of Israel, they often portray Israel as an unfaithful wife. That draws on misogynist understandings of women and how they participate in relationships, and it has bolstered that way of thinking about women. And so as we hear those kinds of metaphors, we need to make sure that we can hear the message and still say there's something problematic about the way that message is sent to us. Yes, faithfulness is important. Our relationship with God is like faithfulness in a marriage. Breaking it is a bad and painful thing, you know, but seeing that as something that we attach to women as all the constant person who is unfaithful is something we need to avoid. So somehow we may need to come up with other kinds of metaphors that can convey the same kind of message that Hosea hoped to convey with his metaphor. All right, let me stop there and see if there are thoughts about Hosea or the exilic prophets in general.
Jerry,
Yes.
we are expecting a grandchild and we're looking at names, and you weren't real helpful about that.
Yeah. Well, the second round is a little better.
Well, the bar is low.
I told Diane I wanted to name our first child Maher-Shalal Hashbaz. That's one of the names from the book of Isaiah, and she didn't go for it at all. No.
Well, she would have to be in high school before she could say the word.
All right, Jan?
Yeah, I'm afraid I'm showing some ignorance here, but are there any female prophets that you would identify?
Yes. We've talked about one or two. Remember when King Josiah was looking for somebody to authenticate the book that they found in the temple? They
Right.
took it to Huldah, who was a woman who was a prophet. So they were not, you know, they were few and far between, but just like there was a judge who was a woman, so there were also prophets. And even if you think about when you get to the New Testament, Luke's story of Jesus being brought to the temple when he's an infant, the woman who is there, someone that God speaks to.
Significant. Thank you.
Other thoughts or questions before we quit tonight? We forgot to take a break. Sorry about that. Well, next week, we'll spend some time talking about the prophets who were around during the exile and what their message is. And we'll talk about the post-exilic prophets. And then we'll turn our attention to the wisdom literature that we find in the Old Testament and to a little bit about the Psalms. So we still have a lot to get done on our last night.
Last night, that's great.
All right, so
Namaste.
that's all right. Well, it was good to be with you all this evening, and I hope to see you all next week.
Thank you, Jerry.
Yeah.
Thanks so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Good night.